The M16 is feared not because it was born perfect, nor because a technical sheet can intimidate someone on its own. It is feared because it has become an entire language. Before becoming a global symbol, it was a strange bet by a small company, almost a provocation against the heavy logic of the post-war era. Before being a recognized family of rifles in any modern military photograph, it nearly had its reputation destroyed in Vietnam. Before becoming a platform, culture, industry, cinema, video game, and standard of comparison, it was the brainchild of Eugene Stoner within ArmaLite, a tiny division of Fairchild, with too many people betting that the future still looked like wood and steel. The most interesting part of the M16 is this: it didn't win because everyone agreed from the beginning. He won after losing, stumbling, being sold out, being misintroduced, being accused, corrected and copied. It's a story of brilliant engineering and turbulent adoption. And, as always on this channel, the focus here is history, high-level design, doctrine, and institution. There are no instructions for use, purchase, modification, or operation. The question is why this object has become so recognizable, so persistent, and so difficult to replace. To understand this, you have to go back to the 1950s. The M1 Garand was already legendary, but it came from another war. The M14 tried to be a solution to continuity, familiar, powerful, more modern on the drawing board, but still heavy, long, and stuck in a battle mentality that imagined a soldier carrying a traditional rifle for a war that was changing. In automatic fire, it was famous for being difficult to control. In jungle, vehicle, patrol, and close combat, weight and length are not details. These are small debts charged every minute. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel. I'll repeat this because technical military history doesn't appear by accident. If you want more episodes with context, failure, factory, doctrine, and reputation, signing up needs to happen while the case is still clear. Then comes Eugene Stoner. He doesn't need to become a showcase saint or a mystical genius with a soundtrack. What matters is more concrete. Stoner came from an aerospace engineering culture, where weight, material, alignment, and efficiency are practical obsessions. He looked at an individual weapon as a set of masses, forces, and functions that could be rearranged. His question wasn't how do we make a slightly better version of the old rifle? It was more uncomfortable: why does this have to be so heavy? In 1954, Stoner joined ArmaLite, a small division of Fairchild. Small indeed. The kind of place where a radical idea still fit in one room, perhaps because there weren't enough departments to kill it cautiously. From there came the AR-10, a 7.62mm rifle that seemed to have arrived before the world itself was ready to look at it without being surprised. Aluminum, fiber, straight line, pieces with more than one function in mind, weight reduction, an almost space-like appearance before the space age really dominated the public imagination. Today it is difficult to feel the shock, because the AR family has become too normal. But in the 1950s, when many rifles still seemed like direct descendants of wood, steel, and imperial tradition, the AR-10 seemed like an indecent suggestion. In the Aberdeen tests in 1957, the AR-10 faced more conventional rivals and lost. Part of the defeat involved a bad decision about an experimental component that Stoner had reportedly objected to, and the episode marked the project at the worst possible time. The Army chose the T-44, which became the M14. The institution preferred the family path. Surprising? Not at all. Large institutions rarely look at something light, black, strange, and radical and say, yes, give this to everyone immediately, the future looks edgy but nice. But the AR-10 lost the competition and still left a seed. The general design, the weight philosophy, the layout, the straight line, the set of solutions that would later be associated with the AR family remained alive. This is the first surprise of the M16, it is born from a defeat. The direct ancestor did not enter through the main door. He stayed outside, writing down the address. Shortly afterwards, the logic changed scale. If the M14 was too heavy and the traditional cartridge cost too much in weight and control, perhaps the question wouldn't be what is the best full-power rifle. Maybe it was how much rifle does a soldier really need to carry for the coming war? The AR-15 was born from this reduction, adapted to the .223 Remington, which would later join the path of the 5.56mm. Choosing a smaller cartridge shouldn't be treated like magic. It was an institutional exchange: less weight per ammunition, less recoil, more manageable control, another volume logic, another way of training and supplying. This is the second surprise. The M16 didn't become important because it was a cute miniature of a larger weapon. He changed the question. The discussion stopped being just individual power and began to include total load, control, cadence, training, logistics, and the reality of soldiers walking, running, boarding, disembarking, and trying to function in terrain that had no regard for tradition. But ArmaLite didn't have the scale to turn the idea into an empire. In 1959, he sold the rights to the AR-15 to Colt for $75,000 plus royalties. In retrospect, this sounds like selling the key to a future city for the price of parking. But hindsight is always arrogant. At that time, it was a small company trying to survive, with an idea too promising to stand still and too expensive to carry alone. Colt knew how to sell. And the story gained an almost absurd scene with General Curtis LeMay, who saw a demonstration in 1960 during a 4th of July party. The folklore version involves watermelon targets and a general impressed enough to want tens of thousands of rifles. It's the kind of episode that seems contrived by a lazy screenwriter, but military takeover has those things. Years of doctrine can be accelerated by a well-placed demonstration and someone with the power to make uncomfortable phone calls. Even before formal adoption by the United States Army, another surprise, British Special Forces were already interested in the AR-15 in a jungle context in the early 1960s. Not because it was an American icon. It wasn't yet. But because it was light, modern, and fit better in certain environments than the L1A1. It's a delightful detail for a story that many people imagine as purely American. The American future, for a moment, was sniffed out by the British before Washington accepted that it existed. Then came Vietnam, and the M16 almost died at birth. If this part has already changed your reading of the weapon, comment one word: project, factory, doctrine, policy, war, or reputation. Short commentary helps define which angles deserve further investigation. The jungle exposed the limitations of the M14 and accelerated the search for something lighter and more controllable. The AR-15 was adopted as the M16 in 1963 and arrived at the conflict with a dangerous mix of technical promise, institutional haste, and poor communication. The rifle looked modern. The theater of war was brutal. The implementation, unfortunately, was a lesson in how to harm a good architecture with system choices. Part of the controversy came from changes in ammunition and specifications that affected field reliability. Some of it came from mismessaging about maintenance and cleaning. Part of it came from missing chrome plating in early standards, insufficient training, inadequate kit, and institutional trust that arrived before infrastructure. The result was serious. There were reports of combat failures, harsh investigations, and public outrage. The M16's reputation was tarnished in a way that no brochure could quickly wash away. It is important to say this without turning the tragedy into a spectacle. When a weapon fails in war, the problem is not a meme. It's a decision chain. Its specification changed, ammunition purchased, training delivered or omitted, manual written, contract signed, part produced, leadership informed, and soldier at the end of the line. The machine itself is just the visible part. The entire system is holding the invisible stock. And here comes the third surprise. The M16's reputation almost died because initial adoption was mixed, but the architecture was too strong to disappear. The corrections came: chambers and barrels with better protection, cleaning kits distributed, revised training, adjusted ammunition, procedural changes, and evolution to the M16A1. What could have become just an expensive failure became an institutional recovery. Not perfect, not instantaneous, not without human cost, but real. This recovery explains much of that feared. It's not the cinematic fear of a perfect weapon. It's the uncomfortable respect for a platform that survived the worst possible start and still spread. The M16 didn't become strong because it never failed. It became strong because it failed publicly, was corrected, continued to be adopted, and became the basis for an entire family of weapons, accessories, training, industry, and culture. After the first third of the story, the drawing needs to be understood at a high level. Stoner sought efficiency. The use of aluminum and polymer reduced weight at a time that was still heavily dependent on steel and wood. The straight line helped manage recoil more stably. The overall ergonomics felt modern. The operating system, often described in an oversimplified manner, integrated parts compactly and reduced mass in areas where other designs carried more components. The beauty was less in an isolated piece and more in the whole, several parts performing more than one function. This is the kind of detail that explains influence without becoming manual. The genius of the project is not in a practical recipe. It's in the philosophy: remove weight, align forces, simplify volumes, make components work together, allow future evolution. The M16 became a platform because it wasn't just a closed object. It was an architecture with room for adaptation. If this no hype, no tutorial approach to technical history is what you came for, sign up now. The channel will continue to open these cases from the inside: the decision, the factory, the war, the politics, and the legacy behind the weapons that everyone recognizes, but few people understand in context. Quick break, sign up now. If this type of analysis without hype and without tutorial makes sense, follow the channel before the next case gets lost in the feed. Global diffusion came in layers. First, specific allies and forces. Then, adoption in dozens of countries. Then, variants and international production. Then, the entire AR family, with the M4, modernized versions, civilian market in some countries, and a gigantic industry around compatibility, accessories, and training. And here's the fourth surprise: the M16 became feared in part because it was no longer just the M16. It became an ecosystem. Ecosystem is a cold but necessary word. An isolated rifle can be good and disappear. A platform creates suppliers, instructors, parts, doctrine, factories, stocks, habits, films, video games, debates, and expectations. Once this happens, replacing the object is not enough. You need to replace the world that grew up around him. The M4 shows this clearly. Adopted as a carbine derived from the M16 family, it began with specific roles and then grew to replace the longer rifle in many contexts. Vehicles, helicopters, urban operations, and recent wars have favored more compact weapons. Improvements in ammunition and optics reduce some of the advantages of the longer barrel. The son ended up taking his father's place in many units, as happens in unsentimental technical families. But the fact that the M4 replaced the M16 in many roles does not diminish the M16's legacy. On the contrary, it shows the strength of architecture. The M16 was not just a product. It was the root of a tree that continued to grow branches. When an institution abandons its original form, but maintains the family, controls, logic, training, and much of the infrastructure, this is not a total defeat. It is evolution by inheritance. At the same time, the M16 was never perfect. And this is where analysis needs to resist empty worship. The overall length of the traditional rifle has become less convenient in modern environments. Reliance on a rear extension limits certain stock configurations. The platform required learning, adequate maintenance, and respect for its margins. The gas system brought advantages and also debates. The original ambidexterity was not perfect. Like all real engineering, it solved problems and created new ones. Compared to the AK, the M16 represents almost the opposite response in temperament. The AK became a symbol of robustness, productive simplicity, and brutal geopolitical scale. The M16 became a symbol of lightness, ergonomics, institutional precision, modularity, and a more adjustable industrial vision. It's not a best for everything score. This type of score usually reveals more about the analyst than the weapons. There are different responses for different states, different wars, different factories, and different doctrines. Fear also comes from cultural image. The M16 appears in photos of Vietnam, in war films, in special forces accounts, in games, in the news, in museums, in training, in political discussions, and in visual collections of almost every modern conflict involving forces aligned with the United States. The silhouette has become a kind of mental shortcut. Even those who don't know how to distinguish variants recognize the format. And recognition, in war and culture, is symbolic power. But there is a risk in this part, confusing familiarity with glamour. The channel does not need to sell the weapon as a desirable object. You need to explain why the image became so strong. The M16 is feared because it represents presence. Presence in alliances, presence in bases, presence in cinema, presence in arsenals, presence in debates, presence in production lines, presence in derivative versions. There are weapons that are frightening due to the myth of their power. The M16 is scary because of the size of its shadow. There is also the issue of replacement attempts. Programs have emerged promising to surpass the AR family completely. Many failed, were cancelled, or met with resistance. Some offered real improvements in specific areas, but came up against the cost of changing training, parts, contracts, production lines, doctrine, and inventories. When a platform is so established, the competitor needs to not only be better. It needs to be better enough to pay the invisible bill for change. This account is often indecent. Before you reach the end, sign up one more time if you haven't already. And leave in the comments which adoption, failure, or platform you want to see open later. The channel grows based on investigation, not object fetishism. The American Next Generation program, with heavier weapons and ammunition in certain roles, shows that the discussion continues. Range, personal protection, weight, recoil, quantity carried, cost and logistics are back on the table. It looks new, but it's old talk with modern clothes. The M16 was born from a trade-off, less weight and greater control against old expectations of power. Now, decades later, armies are still debating where this exchange should go. The ghost of M16 continues to sit at the meeting, probably occupying the best chair. The most ironic part is that many of the arguments against the M16 also help to strengthen it. The Vietnam crisis forced improvements. Criticism of the system stimulated variants. Length limitations paved the way for the M4. The need for optics and accessories pushed upgrades. Pressure from special forces and recent wars has accelerated changes to rails, sights, stocks, ammunition, and general configuration. The project remained influential because it was not frozen. He replied, "This is why Feared needs to be read as adaptation, not propaganda. A weapon that is only famous for a moment becomes a museum piece. A platform that adapts for 6 decades becomes infrastructure." The M16 went from lightweight novelty to standard rifle, from standard rifle to carbine ancestor, from controversial design to ecosystem, from military object to cultural icon. Few machines can traverse so many identities without disappearing into one of them. If you already understand why this story doesn't fit into "it was good" or "it was bad," say in the comments which adoption deserves to be opened later: AK-47, SA-80, G36, Farmers, August, or the path of the M4. This choice helps define the next investigation and keeps the conversation in the right place, context, not fetish. And if you want to follow this line, sign up now. The channel will continue to treat weapons as industrial history, doctrine, and institutional decision, not as object propaganda. The most fascinating thing is that the M16 started small. A division of 9 people, an idea too light to seem serious, a previous rifle that lost testing, a sale of rights that today seems absurd, an almost theatrical demonstration, a hasty adoption, a war that almost destroyed everything. If history stopped in 1967, many people would have declared the project dead, arrogant, and dangerous. It would be an understandable conclusion. It would also have been wrong. Then came decades of service, variants, allies, corrections, copies, children, grandchildren, and endless discussions. The M16 didn't erase the AK. It didn't solve all the infantry's problems. It did not remain intact as a final form. But the language changed. After him, any debate about a modern rifle had to answer the questions he put on the table: how much weight, how much control, how much modularity, how much logistics, how much exchange cost, how much future adaptation. This is perhaps the most sober definition of a feared weapon, not one that seems invincible, but one that forces everyone to position themselves in relation to it. Allies adopt. Enemies study. Competitors copy or reject. Films recognize. Games repeat. Armies try to replace and discover that they are not just exchanging metal, but decades of habit. Coming to the end, last reminder, subscribe to the channel. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the type of viewer who understands that a famous weapon isn't just about specifications. It is an institutional decision with consequences. In the end, M16 is a story about institutional survival. It was nearly destroyed by a poor debut, but the core idea was strong enough to survive its own release. It was born from a small company and became one of the most influential platforms in the world. It has been loved, hated, corrected, shortened, modernized, copied, criticized, and normalized. And this normalization is perhaps the greatest sign of victory. What seemed strange in 1954 has become so common that today it is difficult to imagine the original shock. The futuristic weapon became a reference. The small bet became an ecosystem. The rifle that almost lost its reputation in the beginning ended up helping to define what many people expect from a modern weapon. That's why the M16 is feared. Not because of a mystical aura. Not for perfection. Not for marketing. He is feared because he is everywhere, because he adapts, because he created descendants, because he survived scandal, because he became the visual standard, and because he still forces modern armies to explain why they are maintaining, changing, or trying to replace the family he left behind. A perfect weapon does not exist. An influential project, yes. And few 20th century projects were as influential as this one.